Hi and welcome. My name is Lachlan Wolfers. I'm the Global Head of Indirect Tax for KPMG. And joining me today is Rodney Lawrence, who's the Global Head of International Tax for KPMG, and Matthew Herrington, who's the Head of International Tax for Corporates with KPMG in the UK. Welcome, Rodney, and welcome, Matt.
Nice to see you.
So today we're going to be talking about the recent developments in the consultation by the OECD on the very important BEPS measures focusing on the digital economy. So starting with the discussion around Pillar 1 of those measures, Matthew, what happened in the consultation in early January with the OECD? What's some of the feedback and direction that they're headed in?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of recurring themes that jumped out at me over the 2 days was complexity and the need for simplification. And I think that was sort of present in both of the pillars, but particularly I'd say in Pillar 1 because of the challenges over just the access to data, the tracking and data availability questions that businesses have been raising for a few months. I think as well, just the piece around the tax certainty question, early certainty over, in scope, out of scope, but also effective dispute resolution processes and also mandatory binding dispute resolution processes. I think, as we go over the next sort of few months towards the summer and sort of start to see how these things come together, it's Pillar 1 that's got the biggest, I would say, most significant complexities around it.
It's interesting, Matthew, right? Because Pillar 1 in and of itself doesn't actually reassign that much in terms of tax revenues, but it's certainly, of the two, the most complicated of all, and it requires the most change in taxing systems. So I got to believe that as folk are going through the consultation period and thinking about this point about simplification just has to be top of mind.
I was just saying, the other piece around, you raise a good point, Rodney, around sort of the quantum of tax that's in play here as well. I think it's sort of well trailed that Pillar 2 is probably the bigger revenue raiser. But some of the consultation responses did highlight the fact that a lot of the data as well is based on sort of pre-US reform years, pre-years, prior to sort of a lot of the original BEPS implementation as well. So it'd be quite interesting, I think, to do a sort of more detailed dive on the data as well and actually work out quite, how much revenue either proposal raises. But on balance, I think you're right. Pillar 1 is more of a reallocation. Pillar 2 is really where the revenue raising is.
So it's interesting you say that, Matthew, because, when I would describe myself as an interested observer, not an expert in terms of these topics. And I think two things struck me when I looked at Pillar 1 was the complexity you mentioned and actually the extent to which they were not choosing to leverage a lot of the data that companies already collect in other tax contexts like a VAT. I'm not suggesting it needs to follow a VAT, but really looking at the data that's already collected for that purpose. But the second thing that I picked up on is, when these discussions started, it seemed to be all about Pillar 1. And as they have progressed, it seems to be that Pillar 2 has taken on a life of its own and taken on much greater importance. What have they said about Pillar 2 in the consultation discussions?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of piece there around, if you take this all the way right back to 2013 when a lot of these discussions started, and it was very much around the digital economy. And I think obviously that spawned a number of initiatives, and then there was a real sort of push to avoid the ring fencing piece, which is why it moved into a broader debate around, reforming what the OECD is referred to as the digitalization of the wider economy, which brings in all other businesses beyond, the digital businesses, and then moves into sort of the Pillar 2 piece as well. I think what's sort of interesting around the Pillar 2 discussions is whether or not it continues to be a composite package with Pillar 1. Because, if you believe that the challenges in Pillar 1 are so, large, which it seems a lot of the stakeholders were suggesting, could there be room for a sort of phased implementation where you do a part of Pillar 2 first, and then you bring all of Pillar 2 online, and then you bring parts of Pillar 1 online, and so on. I think it then becomes a real sort of political discussion because obviously some countries are very keen that the two pillars stand together and are not happy to move ahead with one pillar in isolation. And obviously as well, you've got the broader sort of risk that a lot of countries will be balancing around the unilateral measures that could stand in place of Pillar 1 and 2 if the two things don't proceed successfully.
Yeah. And what do you see business doing in terms of getting prepared for the implementation of either Pillar 1 or Pillar 2, Rodney?
Yeah, so we see a couple of things. So first of all, we do see this, let's get a handle on just directionally what this might mean for us, but directionally in a number of different ways. Directionally, yes, in terms of cash tax, because we're still coming out of the pandemic, cash tax is still important. Yes, in terms of financial statement reporting, but also other elements. Other elements in terms of tax department resources. What might we need to do in order to gear up for this? What sort of resourcing should I be putting in front of the CFO, for example? How involved should I be once I understand the impact? So we certainly see folk are more engaged than they were this time last year, for sure, and being a bit more active in terms of understanding what it might mean for them at a granular level, but still at that directional, where are we going type level. I don't know, Matthew, how are you finding it in the UK?
Yes, similar perspective, I would say. A lot of clients obviously really monitoring this very, very closely, sort of day by day, some clients, as these policy discussions evolve. I think some clients now also starting to look ahead to the systems and process build as well. The challenge is there, as we said, around Pillar 1 for collection of particular sources of data and looking at what they can leverage from existing systems and processes. I think a number of people as well just sort of starting to challenge themselves on that sort of readiness assessment. Let's assume something does happen in the summer, in the fall this year, something like that. How ready am I? Have I done, as you say, Rodney, those initial sort of gating assessments, like a bit of modelling, a bit of engagement with my sort of stakeholders internally? Have I thought about the systems and process build? So I think that readiness assessment certainly is sort of coming more to the fore now.
I do think, Lachlan, it sort of does bring, I know it's a theme that we talked a lot about late last year, right? The merging almost of direct and indirect taxes, because, how are you seeing the consequences if this doesn't proceed?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. It's and I was actually going to raise that with Matthew, which is, the elephant in the room in all of this is the threat of digital service taxes. And it was interesting. I had cause a few weeks ago to look at the alternatives to that tax across 8 sort of developing countries, and each of these countries had things like an equalisation levy, or deemed permanent establishment in respect of digital activities, withholding taxes. I was quite shocked by the extent to which they'd unilaterally already taken those steps. Was this raised in the OECD discussions, Matthew? And what's your sense in terms of where that's headed?
Yeah, I think it's a point that both countries and businesses are very much alive to and aware of. As you say, there's been a real proliferation of unilateral measures under different umbrella terms over the last few years. And I think there's definitely a desire that sort of seemed to come through the consultation documents, and I think was reflected in some of the economic impact assessment as well, to avoid further sort of splintering of the international tax regime, try and pull things together and achieve a consensus position. And that's definitely, it came through very strongly in a lot of the stakeholder input as well. And obviously that continues to evolve. You can see sort of last week, the European Commission has moved forward with some proposals around a DST directive. As you say, Lachlan, there are lots of individual countries all over the world that have still got DSTs, in the making or at various stages of implementation and collection. So I think for the meantime, I think at the minute, I think people are holding off, waiting to see if we can achieve that consensus position at OECD.
Okay. On that happy note, we'll finish there. And a big thank you to you, Rodney, and also to you, Matthew. And let's look forward to seeing further developments or discussion on BEPS as we move through 2021. Thank you.
Good talking to you both.
Thanks.